The meteorite streaked across the night sky, a brilliant flash of blue-white against the canvas of stars. Marcus Bailey lowered his telescope, tracking the object's descent with naked eyes as it veered in a way no natural object should. It wasn't following a ballistic trajectory, it was steering. The impact came with less force than expected, more of a controlled landing than a crash. The ground trembled beneath Marcus's observatory, rattling the windows of the converted lighthouse he called home. Dust from rarely disturbed bookshelves filled the air. "That's no meteorite," he muttered, grabbing his jacket and flashlight before hurrying down the spiral staircase. The November air bit at his face as Marcus followed the trail of disturbed earth down the cliffside path. His lighthouse stood isolated on Maine's northernmost coast, which was precisely why he'd chosen it. Isolation suited an astronomer with a damaged reputation and an aversion to questions. Now, something had quite literally crashed into his sanctuary. The object had come to rest in a small cove, steam rising where hot metal met cold Atlantic water. As Marcus approached, he realized it wasn't a craft so much as a pod, barely large enough for a single occupant. The outer shell was pulsing with an ethereal light that shifted from cobalt to violet. A seam appeared along the pod's surface, and the shell peeled back like the petals of a flower. Inside lay a woman, or something that appeared female in form. Her skin had a subtle luminescence, and her hair, which appeared to shift between silver and deep blue depending on how the light hit it, floated around her face as though suspended in liquid. Her eyes snapped open, completely white, without pupil or iris, then shifted rapidly to appear more human, deep violet irises with pupils that contracted in the beam of his flashlight. "Help," she whispered, her voice carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate inside Marcus's chest. "They're coming." Marcus hesitated, scientific curiosity warring with self-preservation. "Who's coming? Who are you?" She struggled to rise, her movements unsteady. "My name is Alara. Please. I mean no harm." Her words were perfect English, but her accent was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard, syllables flowing together like music. Against his better judgment, Marcus extended his hand. When her fingers touched his, a jolt of energy passed between them, and for a split second, he saw impossible visions, a world with twin suns, crystalline cities, and skies filled with vessels unlike any human craft. "You're really not from here," Marcus said, the reality of first contact suddenly concrete rather than theoretical. "No." Alara's gaze darted skyward. "And those who follow will not show your world the mercy you've shown me." As if responding to her fear, the pod began to dissolve, its material breaking down into particles that scattered into the wind. Within moments, all evidence of her arrival had vanished except for a small crystal pendant that hung around her neck, pulsing with the same shifting light as the pod. "We should go," Marcus said, helping her up the path. "Whatever's happening, standing in the open doesn't seem wise." In the lighthouse, Alara moved with careful steps, studying her surroundings with intense fascination. She ran her fingers along book spines and touched the brass fittings of Marcus's telescope with reverence. "You study the stars," she said. It wasn't a question. "I used to. Professionally, I mean. Now I just watch." He didn't elaborate on the academic scandal that had driven him from the university. Alara nodded as though she understood everything he wasn't saying. "Sometimes watching is wiser than interfering." She swayed suddenly, catching herself on the edge of his desk. "You're hurt," Marcus observed. The journey was difficult. Her hand went to the crystal at her throat. "I carry a burden that grows heavier." As she spoke, the houseplants by the window, neglected for months, seemed to lean toward her, their withered leaves uncurling. Outside, the northern lights appeared in the sky, unusually bright and featuring colors Marcus had never observed in the aurora before. "What exactly are you running from, Alara?" he asked. She met his gaze, something ancient and sorrowful in her eyes. From those who would take what I carry and use it to devastate worlds. She looked down at her hands. And perhaps from myself. What I contained could save or destroy. Marcus knew he should call someone, the authorities, his former colleagues, anyone. Instead, he found himself offering her shelter. You can stay until you recover. Then we'll figure out what's next. Ilara's grateful smile was luminous, but as she turned toward the window, Marcus caught her reflection in the glass. For just a moment, her form seemed to contain countless points of light, like a human-shaped galaxy. What had he just invited into his home? 3 weeks had passed since Ilara's arrival, and winter had settled firmly over the main coastline. Marcus found himself becoming accustomed to her presence in ways that should have alarmed him. Each morning, he'd find her at the lighthouse windows, palm pressed against the glass as she watched the sunrise with an expression of mingled wonder and sorrow. "Your star is younger than mine was," she explained one morning, her breath creating delicate frost patterns that spiraled outward across the window in impossible fractals. "It sings a different song." Marcus had learned not to dismiss her odd statements. "You can hear the sun?" Ilara smiled, the violet of her eyes deepening. "Not with ears. But yes, all stars communicate, gravity waves, magnetic pulses, neutrino emissions. My people evolved to sense these things." Her people. She spoke of them rarely, and always in past tense. Outside, the garden that had been dormant when she arrived now thrived despite the snow. Plants that shouldn't bloom until spring displayed vibrant flowers, their stems reaching toward the lighthouse as if seeking something. "They respond to you," Marcus observed, bringing her tea, a beverage she developed an immediate fondness for. "All living things are connected by the same fundamental energies," Ilara replied, accepting the cup. Where her fingers touched the ceramic, tiny luminescent patterns appeared briefly before fading. "Your scientists are beginning to understand this, but my civilization built our entire existence around it." Marcus had begun keeping a journal of these phenomena, the accelerated plant growth, the unusual aurora patterns that appeared nightly, the way electronic equipment occasionally malfunctioned in her presence. As an astronomer, he'd trained himself to observe and document, even when understanding lagged behind. "The pendant," he ventured, gesturing to the crystal that never left her neck. "It's related to why you're here, isn't it?" Ilara's hand moved instinctively to the crystal, which pulsed more frequently when she was anxious. "It's part of me now," she said softly. "I cannot remove it." Their conversation was interrupted by the radio, which Marcus kept for weather reports. Instead of the usual forecast, the broadcast described unusual solar activity causing communication disruptions globally. Astronomers at major observatories report receiving signals of unknown origin. The pattern appears artificial but doesn't match known human transmissions. Officials stress there's no cause for alarm, though amateur radio operators are asked to report any unusual. Marcus switched it off, finding Ilara's gaze already on him, her expression tense. "They've found my trail," she whispered. "Who are they?" Marcus asked, not for the first time. Instead of answering, Ilara moved to his telescope, adjusting it with surprising expertise. "Look," she said, stepping aside. Marcus peered through the eyepiece at a section of sky that should have contained only distant stars. Instead, he saw a faint distortion, like heat waves on a summer road. "What am I seeing?" "A cloaked vessel. Their technology bends light, but not perfectly." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "They're in your solar system now." That night, unable to sleep, Marcus found Ilara on the lighthouse gallery, standing beneath the stars with her arms outstretched. The skin of her forearms had become translucent, revealing a network of light that pulsed in rhythm with the crystal at her throat. As she absorbed the starlight, the ambient temperature around her dropped significantly. "You're feeding?" he asked, pulling his robe tighter against the chill. She lowered her arms, her skin gradually returning to opacity. Sustaining, she corrected. What I carry requires energy. And what exactly do you carry, Elara? Marcus asked, his scientific patience finally giving way. I've given you shelter, kept your presence secret. I think I deserve some truth. Elara was silent for so long that Marcus thought she might ignore the question entirely. Finally, she took his hand, placing it against the crystal pendant. Immediately, his mind filled with voices, thousands, perhaps millions of them, all speaking at once in a language he couldn't understand but somehow felt the emotional texture of loss, hope, fear, determination. When she broke the connection, Marcus staggered back, his mind reeling. What was that? My people, she said simply. What remains of them? In the village 5 miles down the coast, Marcus's grocery trips had become opportunities to monitor the outside world. The local diner was abuzz with talk of the strange phenomena, unusual northern lights, electronic glitches, unexplained power surges. Marcus kept his head down, ordering his supplies quickly. Bailey. Thought you might have frozen to death up in that lighthouse. Marcus turned to find Dar. Vivian Ortega, a former colleague from his university days, now directing research at a nearby astronomical facility. Just the usual winter hibernation, he replied carefully. What brings you here, Viv? The signal anomalies, she said, her excitement evident. Every major observatory is tracking them. Something's out there, Marcus, and it's not natural. She leaned closer. The government's involved now. My facility's been practically taken over by people with badges and non-disclosure agreements. Marcus's throat tightened. Probably just a satellite malfunctioning. Vivian laughed. Always the skeptic. That's why they forced you out, you know. You never could see the big picture. She slid a card across the counter. If you notice anything unusual from your perch up there, call me. Some of us still respect your observational skills, even if your theories were problematic. As Marcus drove back to the lighthouse, snow beginning to fall heavily, he noticed unusual lights moving above the cloud cover, too fast for aircraft, too controlled for meteors. When he reached the lighthouse, he found Elara huddled in the corner of the living room, the crystal at her throat pulsing rapidly. Around her, every electronic device had failed, and the air crackled with static electricity. They're scanning, she whispered, her voice strained. I'm trying to mask our presence, but what I carry, it resonates. It wants to be found. Marcus closed the blinds and sat beside her, scientific curiosity now fully eclipsed by concern. Elara, I need to understand what's happening. What exactly are you protecting, and why does it put Earth in danger? Elara looked at him, her eyes momentarily shifting to that unsettling pure white before returning to violet. My world was dying, she began softly. And what I carry is either its salvation, or a weapon that could unmake your planet. Outside, the northern lights flared with unprecedented intensity, forming patterns that no natural aurora could create. In the garden, the flowers turned simultaneously toward the lighthouse, as if listening. The blizzard that had enveloped the lighthouse for 3 days finally broke, revealing a transformed landscape. Snow crystals refracted sunlight in unnatural patterns, creating prismatic halos around every surface. Marcus had noticed this phenomenon spreading gradually from the lighthouse, ordinary physics bending subtly in Elara's presence. His scientific training demanded documentation, but fear kept his observations private. The collection of anomalies grew daily, compass needles that pointed toward Elara rather than north, electronics that powered on without batteries, and most disturbing, the dreams, vivid visions of crystalline cities and catastrophic destruction that didn't feel like products of his own imagination. They're not your dreams, Elara confirmed when he finally mentioned them. What I carry, they remember. And sometimes those memories leak into receptive minds. Marcus had set up monitoring equipment throughout the lighthouse, measuring radiation levels, electromagnetic fluctuations, and temperature variations. The data patterns were unlike anything in scientific literature, energy signatures that shouldn't exist in normal spacetime. "I need to understand what's happening," Marcus said, showing Alara the readings. "These energy spikes are increasing in frequency and intensity. Whatever you're carrying, it's becoming unstable." Alara gazed at his instruments, her expression sorrowful. It was never meant to be contained this long. Especially not by a single vessel. She led him to the highest point of the lighthouse tower, where the old beacon had once guided ships. The crystal at her throat pulsed more rapidly as they climbed, its light casting strange shadows that moved independently of their source. "My world was called Valyria," she began, looking out toward the horizon where the ocean met sky. "We were an ancient civilization, millions of years ahead of Earth technologically, but also spiritually. We had learned to externalize consciousness, to separate it from physical form." As she spoke, the crystal began to glow more intensely, and Marcus felt a strange pressure in his mind, as if something was trying to show him images directly into his thoughts. "Our star was dying, becoming unstable centuries before we had predicted. There wasn't time to relocate our entire population." Her voice grew distant. "Our council created the Soul Matrix, a crystalline structure capable of housing consciousness without bodies. A way to preserve our people until we could find them a new home." She touched the pendant at her throat, and suddenly Marcus was no longer standing in the lighthouse. In his mind, he saw a vast chamber filled with beings of light, their forms only vaguely humanoid. In the center of the chamber, a crystal structure grew, absorbing these light beings one by one. "Billions of souls," Alara continued, "compressed into a lattice of quantum entanglement. All our knowledge, our history, our essence, preserved." The vision shifted, showing armored figures forcing their way into the chamber, weapons that seemed to tear holes in reality itself. The Krivak, a militant faction from a neighboring system. They learned what we had created. They saw not a preservation of life, but a power source, a weapon. The Soul Matrix contains enough energy to ignite a star. Or destroy one. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Marcus disoriented. Alara stood before him, her normal appearance momentarily replaced by a form composed of countless points of light, like a human-shaped galaxy. "You're one of them?" Marcus asked. "I was the Matrix Guardian," she replied, her form solidifying again. "When the Krivak attacked, the Council transferred the entire Matrix into my modified biology. I became the vessel, tasked with finding a suitable world where my people could be released safely." Marcus struggled to process the implications. "And these Krivak, they're the ones searching for you now?" Alara nodded. "They've tracked me across 17 systems. I thought Earth was remote enough. I was wrong." She turned to him, her eyes showing that unsettling whiteness again. "Marcus, the Matrix is destabilizing. Containing billions of consciousnesses was never meant to be a permanent solution." As if to emphasize her point, the crystal flared brilliantly, and every electronic device in the lighthouse surged and died simultaneously. Outside, the aurora appeared in broad daylight, rippling with colors no human eye had ever seen in a natural aurora. "The energy is leaking," she continued, her voice taking on that resonant quality that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his mind. "Each discharge affects your planet's magnetic field, its atmosphere. If the Matrix fully destabilizes while I'm here, it could destroy Earth," Marcus finished, the scientist in him already calculating the probable effects of such an energy release. "Yes. Or worse, it could tear a hole in reality itself, creating a cascade that would collapse spacetime in this region of your galaxy." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Marcus moved to the window and saw 3 black helicopters approaching from the south, their flight path direct and purposeful. "They've found us," he said, turning back to Alara. How? I've told no one about you. Ilara's expression was resigned. The Matrix's energy signature has grown too strong to hide. Your world's instruments can detect it now. Marcus's phone rang, a device that should have been dead given the electromagnetic disturbances. The caller ID showed Vivian Ortega. Marcus, Vivian's voice was tense. There's a government team heading to your location. They've detected some kind of exotic energy signature centered on your lighthouse. I tried to warn you earlier, but... You told them where to look, he realized, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. When you saw me in town. They already knew something was there, Vivian defended. I just confirmed you might have observed something. They mentioned national security, Marcus. He ended the call, turning to Ilara. We need to leave. Now. But Ilara shook her head, her form flickering between solid and that strange constellation-like state. It's too late. The Matrix is reaching critical instability. Moving now would only accelerate the process. She placed her hands on either side of his face. I'm sorry for bringing this to your world, Marcus. I had nowhere else to go. The air around them seemed to vibrate, and through the windows, Marcus saw the approaching helicopters falter, their engines affected by the growing electromagnetic disturbance. In the garden below, the unnaturally blooming plants had begun to glow with the same light as Ilara's crystal. There has to be a solution, Marcus insisted, the problem-solving part of his mind racing. If your people's technology could create this matrix, there must be a way to stabilize it, to release it safely. Ilara's eyes widened slightly. There is one possibility, she said slowly. But it would require a compatible biosphere, one that could absorb and integrate the consciousnesses gradually, without destruction. The helicopters had landed on the cliff edge, and figures in dark tactical gear were advancing toward the lighthouse. Through the windows, Marcus could see they carried equipment unlike any conventional military gear, devices that seemed designed to contain or neutralize energy. Could Earth be that biosphere? He asked urgently. Ilara's gaze became distant, as if she was consulting with the multitude she carried. Yes, she finally said. But the process would change your world in ways I cannot fully predict. And we would need time we no longer have. The front door of the lighthouse burst open. Upstairs, they could hear boots on the spiral staircase. Do you trust me? Ilara asked, her form now pulsing between human and light with increasing frequency. Marcus looked at her, this being who carried within her the last remnants of an entire civilization, who had fled across the stars to preserve them, who had trusted him with her secret. In her eyes, human seeming one moment and star-filled the next, he saw both ancient wisdom and very recognizable fear. Yes, he said simply. The crystal at her throat flared with blinding intensity as the first agents reached the top of the stairs. The search grid expanded across 3 states by the 5th day after Marcus and Ilara's disappearance. Military helicopters crisscrossed the transformed landscape, their sensors calibrated to detect the unique energy signature of the Matrix. On the ground, teams in hazmat suits collected samples of the altered flora, plants that now exhibited properties never before seen in terrestrial vegetation, with cellular structures that seemed to flicker between organic matter and pure energy. Director Powell stood at the command center, surveying the wall of monitors that displayed the spreading phenomenon. What had begun in the forests of Maine now reached into New Hampshire and Vermont, a slowly expanding circle of transformation. It's not destroying anything, Dr. Harrington observed, reviewing the latest data. The altered ecosystems remain in balance, they're just different. Enhanced, somehow. Different is dangerous, Powell replied flatly. We don't know the long-term effects of this alien integration. Vivian Ortega had been quietly analyzing patterns in the transformation spread. There's intelligence guiding this, she said, pointing to her findings. The changes follow watersheds, avoid populated areas, and seem to prioritize already damaged ecosystems. This isn't a random process, it's deliberate and careful. Before Powell could respond, an urgent call came through. Sir, we've located them. Northern Vermont, Green Mountain Range. Satellite imagery shows an unusual structure has grown at the summit. Marcus stood at the edge of the newly formed clearing, his body simultaneously exhausted and energized in ways he couldn't have imagined possible before merging partially with the Matrix. Around him, the mountain peak had transformed into a crystalline nexus, a structure that resembled a cathedral grown from living crystal, its spires rising nearly 100 feet into the air. Within these translucent walls, countless points of light moved in complex, beautiful patterns. Elara, or what remained of her individual identity within the collective consciousness they now shared, manifested beside him in a loosely humanoid form composed of swirling lights. "They're coming," she said, her voice now a harmonic blend that resonated within his mind rather than reaching his ears. "You're military. They fear what they don't understand." "Most humans would," Marcus replied, gazing down the mountainside ere the first signs of the approaching forces were visible, the glint of sunlight on vehicles winding up access roads. "Change terrifies us, especially change we didn't choose." "And yet you chose this," Elara observed, gesturing to his altered form. While still appearing human, Marcus's physiology had changed dramatically. His cells now contained traces of the same crystalline structure that formed the Matrix, allowing him to serve as an interface between human and Valyrian consciousness. "I saw no other way to bridge our worlds," he said simply. Someone had to translate, to help both sides understand. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder. Within the crystal cathedral, the lights shifted, forming defensive patterns. "They won't attack," Marcus assured both Elara and the collective consciousness she represented. "Not once they understand." Around them, the transformed forest hummed with energy. Trees that had once been ordinary pines now reached skyward with graceful crystalline branches that captured sunlight and converted it with unprecedented efficiency. The ground beneath their feet pulsed with networks of luminescent mycelia that linked all living things in a vast communication system. Birds with subtly altered plumage that shimmered with bioluminescence circled overhead, their awareness expanded by the gentle integration of Valyrian consciousness. "It's beautiful," came a voice from the edge of the clearing. Marcus turned to find Vivian standing there, having somehow advanced ahead of the military forces. She wore no protective gear, just a simple jacket against the mountain chill. "It is," Marcus agreed. "And it's only the beginning." Vivian approached cautiously, her scientific curiosity evidently overcoming her fear. "What exactly is happening here, Marcus? What have you and she become?" Before he could answer, the rest of the government contingent arrived, soldiers establishing a perimeter, scientists setting up monitoring equipment, and Director Powell advancing with a wary expression. "Bailey," Powell acknowledged, pointedly ignoring Elara's luminous form. "You've led us on quite a chase." "The integration needed time," Marcus explained. "Uncontrolled release would have been catastrophic, exactly what we were trying to prevent at your facility." "Integration," Powell repeated the word with skepticism. "That's what you call this alien takeover of our ecosystem?" In response, Marcus gestured toward a nearby stream that flowed down the mountainside. "Test that water. It's pure, cleaner than anything on Earth has been for centuries. The soil around it can now sustain crops with triple the yield and double the nutritional value." He pointed to the transformed trees. "These convert carbon dioxide to oxygen with unprecedented efficiency and can withstand climate extremes that would kill ordinary trees." Dr. Harrington, who had been taking readings nearby, looked up from his instruments with undisguised wonder. "He's right. The biochemistry is revolutionary. This could solve our climate crisis, our food shortages." "At what cost?" Powell demanded. "Our humanity? Our independence?" Elara's form shifted, condensing into something more recognizably humanoid. When she spoke, Her voice was audible to all present, though it still carried those strange harmonics. "We do not seek to replace, only to enhance," she said. "My people faced extinction. Rather than perish entirely, we found a way to preserve our consciousness, our knowledge, our essence. Now we offer that knowledge to your world." "As what, silent partners?" Powell asked. "As grateful refugees," Elara corrected. "We cannot exist as we once did, physical forms capable of independent life. But we can exist alongside your life forms, in symbiosis. We offer our millennia of scientific and spiritual advancement, you offer us continuation." Marcus stepped forward. "The integration is voluntary, Director. The Matrix doesn't force itself on any living thing. It offers connection, enhancement, but requires acceptance." He gestured to his own altered form. "I chose this to help facilitate understanding between our species." "And the environmental changes?" Dr. Harrington asked, gesturing to the transformed landscape. "Necessary adaptations," Marcus explained. "The Matrix needs a compatible medium, ecosystems that can support the energy patterns of Valyrian consciousness. But the changes benefit Earth as well. Enhanced resilience, accelerated regeneration of damaged ecosystems, more efficient energy utilization at the cellular level." Powell looked unconvinced, but Vivian had been quietly taking readings with her own instruments, her expression growing increasingly amazed. "Director," she interrupted, "these readings suggest that transformed areas are actually sequestering carbon at rates that could reverse global warming within decades. And the biodiversity indices are increasing, not decreasing. Whatever this is, it's healing our planet, not harming it." A tense silence fell over the group, broken only by the gentle humming emanation from the crystal structure. Finally, Powell holstered his sidearm, a gesture of tentative de-escalation. "Assuming we even considered accepting this integration," he said carefully, "what are your intentions? How far will this spread?" Elara's form shimmered as she considered the question. "The Matrix seeks equilibrium. We estimate approximately 30% of Earth's biosphere would provide sufficient medium for our complete integration, primarily focusing on already damaged ecosystems that would benefit most from enhancement." "And populated areas?" Powell pressed. "Will remain untouched unless invited otherwise," Marcus assured him. "Human consent is paramount. Some may choose partial integration, as I have, to act as intermediaries. Others may choose to remain completely unaltered. Both paths are valid." Powell exchanged glances with his advisors, clearly struggling with a situation beyond any protocol or precedent. "I need assurances. Tangible proof that this won't eventually overcome human autonomy." In response, the crystal cathedral began to pulse with increasing brilliance. Within its translucent walls, the points of light coalesced into a vast, complex pattern that projected outward, enveloping the entire mountaintop in a dome of gentle radiance. Within this dome, everyone present suddenly experienced a profound mental clarity, access to a shared consciousness that offered understanding without overwhelming individual identity. For one breathtaking moment, humans and Valyrians existed in perfect communion. Each person received a glimpse of the vast repository of knowledge the Matrix contained, scientific advancements beyond human imagination, philosophical understandings developed over millions of years, and the profound gratitude of a civilization given a second chance at existence. As the effect faded, leaving each person whole and unchanged but deeply moved, Marcus observed the transformed expressions around him, wonder replacing fear, curiosity overcoming suspicion. "That," he said quietly, "is what's being offered. Not conquest, but collaboration. Not replacement, but enhancement. The choice will always remain with humanity." Powell stood silent for a long moment, then turned to his communications officer. "Stand down all combat units. Reclassify this as a first contact scenario, not a containment operation." To Marcus and Elara, he added, this isn't over. There will be negotiations, treaties, endless discussions about sovereignty and security. As there should be, Marcus agreed. This is just the beginning of a very long conversation. As the military and scientific teams began to establish a more permanent base of operations at the foot of the mountain, Vivian approached Marcus one final time. "I betrayed you," she said simply. "I'm sorry." Marcus studied her, seeing her differently now through his enhanced perception. "Fear makes us do terrible things sometimes. But we can move beyond it." She nodded, glancing toward the crystal cathedral. "Is she still Elara? The individual you knew?" "Yes and no," Marcus replied, looking at the luminous form beside him. "She's part of the collective consciousness now, but her individual pattern remains distinct, as will mine, eventually. We are many and one simultaneously." "That sounds lonely," Vivian observed. Elara's form shimmered. "It is the opposite of loneliness," her harmonious voice explained. "It is belonging, while still retaining selfhood. Something your species might come to understand, in time." As twilight fell over the mountain, the transformed forest began to glow with soft bioluminescence, blues and greens and purples that had never before existed in Earth's nighttime landscape. Above, the aurora had become a permanent fixture in the sky, a shimmering bridge between worlds that would serve as both memorial to a lost civilization and promise of a new synthesis. Marcus stood at the threshold of the crystal cathedral, positioned between worlds, not fully human anymore, not fully Valyrian, but something new. Before him stretched centuries of gradual integration, of careful guidance, of helping two vastly different forms of consciousness learn to coexist. "Are you certain of your choice?" Elara asked, her form fluctuating beside him. "You can still return to your former self. The changes are not yet permanent." Marcus gazed at the transformed landscape spreading outward from the mountain, life enhanced rather than replaced, potential multiplied rather than diminished. In the distance, he could see the first tendrils of transformation following river valleys toward damaged ecosystems, seeking to heal rather than conquer. "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied, extending his hand toward her luminous form. Where they touched, their energies merged in a beautiful interplay of light, separate identities in perfect harmony. Around them, billions of preserved consciousnesses continued their careful awakening, finding new expression in Earth's willing biosphere. A world that had died was reborn, not as it had been, but as something new, a synthesis that honored both what had been lost and what had been found. The secret Elara had carried across the stars was no longer a burden to be feared, but a gift to be shared, one consciousness at a time, one ecosystem at a time, bridging worlds that had evolved separately but could now evolve together. And above it all, the stars watched in silent witness, as they had witnessed countless endings and beginnings throughout the cosmos, the eternal cycle of transformation that connects all living things, regardless of the worlds they call home.